This is President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the woman who is the pride of Africa, especially for African women. This lady waited and waited to see Africa's first female president to express her delight.
Madam, we are very proud of you. Very proud of you.
Madam, we are very proud of you, she said. The Liberian leader is on her way to the Martins Brazos EU Hotel for the first point in her loaded Europe 2014 rendezvous. My name is Mamadi Diakite. I was with President Sirleaf and the Liberian delegation to the 4th EU-Africa Summit in Brussels, and I also covered President Sirleaf's on her visit to Rome. Join me for a series of special reports on President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf global engagements in Brussels and Rome.
Come and save your child.
She arrives at this high-level panel on fragile states gathering, organized by the African Development Bank, the European Union, and the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building. The event is also convened to launch a special report on the HLP on fragile states, entitled Ending Conflicts and Building Peace in Africa, a Call to Action. President Sirleaf is joined by her counterpart, Ghanaian President John Mahama. And these are two of the authors of the reports, Ms. Sarah Cliff and Jiber Hongbo, are attending this event to give an insight on the 38-page report, simplified in English and French. In this audience, African ministers, representatives from civil society organizations around the world, global actors on peace and security are here to listen and participate as the world derives strategies to deal with state fragility. The African Development Bank Group set up the high-level panel on fragile states to advise the institution on strategies in handling fragile states. The world spends $100 billion annually to handle conflict-related issues around the world. 20 of the world's 36 fragile states are in Africa. Experts say when unemployment is high and economic activities are not strong in any country, the possibility of crisis stands very strong. This is why the African Development Bank Group set up the panel to avoid post-crisis countries from sliding back into conflict situations. After the usual protocol, she gives a background to the logic that advanced the establishment of the high-level panel on fragile states.
When President Kaberuka decided to establish the high-level panel on fragile states, he said that despite the fact that we, as a bank and our partners, have been working to address conflict and fragility for more than a decade now, we still seem not to have got it right. There is still so much that we do not know. Therefore, the panel was mandated to provide expert guidance on targeted assistance beyond financial support to accelerate state building and peace building, provide recommendations, actions, policies, and strategies that should be pursued by the bank and global partners alike in order to further improve its development effectiveness in situations of fragility. Under the guidance and leadership of Her Excellency Madam President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the 7 eminent members of the panel deliberated for over a year. The panel held country dialogues and consultations, discussed with members of the civil society, private sector, as well as development partners.
The 8-member panel set up by the ADB is headed by Liberia's President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Here, as keynote speaker, she expands upon the meaning of state fragility.
Fragility experienced by states when internal or external pressures become too great for national institutions and political processes to manage, thereby creating a risk of violence. Needless to say, the most vulnerable of such states are post-conflict countries, like my own, Liberia, which lack robust functioning institutions, that lack diversified economies, many times lack inclusive political systems to be able to manage those risks. The work of the panel, very consultative in its nature, by engaging civil society, academia, government, private sector, to get all of their views on how we respond to the vulnerabilities of states, thereby seeing them experience fragility. It culminated in this good report. I think it's a great report. I hope everyone would have a chance to read it. Ending conflict and building peace in Africa. More importantly, a call to action. It's important that all of our friends and supporters, all of those who have invested so much in African development, join in the call of this report for adequate policy responses to disruptive social, economic, and environmental changes by building resilience in our states and in our societies. We need stronger links of institutions and partnership among the private sector, among civil society, all of the institutions that are part of this collective political arena involved in managing the processes of development. That's how we get sustainable peace, sustainable development. Regionalism is very important in this regard, and the African Development Bank has singled out a few countries in this respect. I know my own region, the Mano River Union countries, comprising Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and La Côte d'Ivoire, have been singled out because we were all involved in a conflict that crossed borders. We all have these strong vulnerabilities because of large numbers of unemployed youth, because in some cases, not all of them, lack of a diversified economy, depending upon one monocrop, dysfunctional institutions. And so the African Development Bank has been trying to make sure that we respond in such a way to expand the interconnectivity, the interaction, the linkages between our institutions as a means of ensuring that stability in one would in effect be stability for all, and economic empowerment in one would spill over the borders and be economic empowerment for all.
Glad for that.
Also making contribution to this interactive session, Ghana's President John Mahama makes some point on how youth unemployment can be reduced. Unemployment remains a strong element that contributes to state fragility. Experts on conflict resolutions have indicated.
Most countries, we are still building our democratic institutions, and so direct support for capacity building, for parliaments, for the judiciary, for anti-corruption agencies, for even civil society organizations and so on and so forth is very important. And we've enjoyed a lot of support from the EU and several other institutions in terms of strengthening, institutions of democracy. But certainly the report captures all the other things. Youth employment is an area that we need to watch. Africa's population is the fastest growing, and the youth are being churned out of school like on a conveyor belt. I mean, how are you going to keep them engaged so that we avoid, in the English proverb, they say the devil finds work for idle hands. How do you engage the youth so that they don't get engaged by the devil in, social deviance and other such areas. But of course, coming right out of the ECOWAS meeting, for us, the new horizon that we must push and push firmly is to integrate our economies. I believe that we have a better chance of growing comparatively in all our countries.
Wow. Now it is time to hear from the authors of the report, beginning with Sarah Cliff, Special Advisor and Assistant Secretary General of Civilian Capacities to the United Nations. Sarah has worked for the last 20 years in countries emerging from conflict and political transition. To portray the reality of state fragility, she uses the Malian example on handling post-crisis issues. Mali has seen violence with the infiltration of terrorism in the north, which was later wiped out by the French superior air power.
I would give an example of this from a visit that I made to Mali 3 weeks ago. So the situation in Mali is sometimes seen as being a combination of poverty and terrorism threats. I think that oversimplifies. Mali was facing structural challenges before this: population growth of 3%, urbanization rates of more than 5% a year, desertification, which was destroying traditional pastoral lands and taking away sources of livelihood for many of the population, and external stressors which came not only through armed terrorist groups but also through trafficking patterns, in particular in the north of Mali. So when I visited there as part of support to the government to look at the kinds of capacity building and institution building they wanted in the post-conflict program, I saw some messages from people on the ground in the north that very much supported the messages in this report. First, people wanted to see security, justice, and job creation in very basic terms. But they wanted to see security, justice, and job creation delivered through their own national institutions. So they wanted to see their administration coming out to deliver this, not only international NGOs or international partners.
This is Guibert Hongbo, former chief of staff at the UNDP and former prime minister of Togo under Faure Gnadingbe. He comes with vast experience in accounting and finance. At the moment, he works at the International Labour Organization as Deputy Director General. He is one of the authors of the HLP on Fragile States report, and he gives an outlook of some of the recommendations in the document.
The report recognized the fact that, and Sarah also mentioned it, we recognize that some of the issues are broader than the continent. I believe this one is very, very important. And therefore, some of the recommendations also are to the broader stakeholders. And then the second set are very specific to Africa Development Bank. And from the broader perspective, it is very important, be it in Africa, be it elsewhere, that the national development strategies at the beginning integrate how do you deal with the drivers for change, the drivers for fragility that Sarah has highlighted. How do we contribute into building much more resilient societies instead of waiting for the crisis to erupt and then we try to become a reactive approach. The second dimension of the recommendation, which is a bit linked to the first one, the importance to have the nexus from humanitarian to development and peace, consolidation of peace should much greater seen as all of them intertwined. We cannot look at them separately, one out from the other, and that has to have a major impact. Maybe a decade ago, we still, especially at the international level, very hesitating in dealing with the security reform, in dealing with the police and the army reform, because we are all worried that there will be a heavy criticism. Today is very clear that you don't deal with democracy, you don't deal with peace if you don't look at the issue about reforming the security sector, and the development dimension has to be linked to all those aspects, including the humanitarian dimension.
Now is the Q&A session, and kicking off the interaction is the foreign minister of the world's youngest nation, South Sudan. His name is Barnaba Maria Benjamin. He wants the world to understand that not all of Sudan is in turmoil.
South Sudan was supposed to launch the New Deal by February this year, but because of the crisis we went into, we had to postpone it because we have the chair of the G7 in launching the New Deal for the G7+. But the problem, I think, and I hope both the leadership here must have realized, is that sometimes with our partners, there seems to be an element of conditionality, conditions put to it. We in South Sudan see no reason why we wouldn't launch the New Deal, despite the problems we have. But it comes out because of the recent crisis that took place. Then everything is suspended, which I think this approach is not appropriate in the circumstances. Because if you look at South Sudan, it's a huge country of about 10 states in it. It is bigger than France, for example. You get 3 states out of 10, that's where the problem is. You have the chunk of land. The other 7 states are normal, government issues are running smoothly. Why would you then postpone? Simply because there seems to be a crisis of part of the country. And we were telling the Americans, you are in Iraq now, when it is in turmoil, you haven't stopped what you would want to do. So the problem of the New Deal, frankly speaking, is a wonderful solution in replacing the Millennium Development Goals that we wanted. But if you are going to wait until you get absolute peace, then you begin the process, then we are getting it wrong. Because in order even to bring that stability, you need to implement what you believe in the New Deal.
And President John Mahama agrees with Minister Benjamin. He said Ghana's partners are also holding back support because of Ghana's budget deficit.
They are peace, but we suffered a deficit. We had a drop in prices of our 2 leading exports, cocoa and gold, and then we suffered some of our expenditure in 2012 during the elections. We're trying to bring that down and bring the deficit down. And yet our partners are holding on to multi-donor budget support because they say you have a budget deficit. And this support is going to critical areas to help us meet the MDGs. We have an accelerated maternal mortality program to be able to meet the 2015 MDGs. There's a hold on all these program support because of a deficit. And so it's not even conflict alone, even when the country is at total peace. I mean, yes, we're implementing adjustment to bring the deficit down, but I don't bring the deficit down in 1 year. It takes a couple of years to turn the deficit around. But in that period, it's being made worse by holding on to support of about $500 million, And so there's a lack of understanding, sometimes between ourselves and our partners. And I think that point you made is good. South Sudan is not all in flames. It's a certain portion of it. As the rest of the country sit and wait because of an isolated portion being in conflict. I guess you have a very good question there.
Let me add to that. I think Chiba made the point that an important element of responding to vulnerabilities in state is for partnership institutions to change their own procedures. That means that you cannot apply conditionalities, procurement rules, that are formulated in conditions that are normal to states that are going through difficulties. We've challenged the African Development Bank and the World Bank to change their processes if they're going to be more responsive to countries in these particular circumstances. And we've been seeing some changes. So you have to press on. Don't let them off the hook. So keep after them and say you want to start the process of your fragile state program. You're going to make sure that you try to maintain stability, and with their support you can do it. So we have to keep fighting those conventional and traditional methods of doing things until we can bring the reform that's so necessary.
And this participant sent us a question on agriculture and education.
I am an EU journalist, Brussels-based from France, and I'm covering for several media here, including a new one started by one of my colleagues, from Rwanda. It's called Yambola. In the business forum just across the city, there was a lot of talk yesterday about the agribusiness and also about education. Now, about education, they were saying that there is no point in having so many people graduates in humanities if you have so very few engineers. So what is your view on how to make education more adjustable to the needs of other countries? And as far as agribusiness, I'd like to have your views on this.
And sharing the Ghanaian experience, President Mahama had this in response.
We are the second largest producer of cocoa, and yet we can export our cocoa freely into the European Union, but let us process it into chocolate, and we have a problem exporting chocolate into the European Union. I mean, there are all kinds of non-tariff barriers and other things that make it difficult for us to export finished product. And so what we're saying is, we want to restructure our economy. We produce agricultural products. We want to bring some of the value addition and processing into Africa in order that we are able to find jobs for the growing number of young people. And so many years on, why would we continue to export bauxite from Ghana and have it processed into alumina somewhere else, import the alumina to feed our aluminium smelter, and then re-export the aluminium? Why can't we have an integrated bauxite and alumina plant? And we can't do this ourselves because we can't leverage the capital to be able to do it. We need to do it in partnership with the private sector, domestic or foreign. The domestic private sector is weak, so necessarily partner with foreign investors to be able to do something like this. And so there are opportunities like that in all our countries. Liberia produces a lot of rubber, so she should be one of the largest exporter of ties in this country or other rubber products, but she's not. And so these are some of the areas we're looking at. In agribusiness, there's a lot of opportunity in Africa for processing and value addition. With education, yes, you made a very valid point. That's one of the areas that we are beginning to look at. We're turning out thousands of graduates every year, not necessarily in the areas that the job market is looking for. And so we have an oil and gas industry that is growing in Ghana. We have a services sector that is looking for specific skills. There's a demand for technicians, electricians, plumbers, and so on and so forth. And yet we're producing hundreds of thousands of marketing graduates. What is there to market? Hundreds of thousands of MBAs. How much is there to administer? And so, yes, there's a structural problem. And in my State of the Nation address, I called on the educational institutions and the Association of Ghanaian Industries and Private Sector to have a meeting and come out to do a survey as to what skill sets is our job market looking for. And if we know what the skill sets they are looking for is, then we must adjust the curriculum to suit what the job market is looking for. It doesn't pay to produce hundreds of thousands of graduates when you can't find any work for them. I mean, if you turn up in front of the Unilever factory and say, I want a job, I did a degree in Roman civilization, what the hell? You're not going to get a job, definitely.
And here is President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's response on the agriculture aspect of the question. She highlights some of the constraints facing the people in graduating from the informal sector to investment in commercial agriculture.
Liberia is in a rainforest. 43% of our land is in forest. We own 43% of the biodiversity in the sub-region. 26% of our land is arable. Only 2% under cultivation because they do not have the capital or the technology to be able to move from the informal sector with production for subsistence to the place where they're producing for surplus. So while one must protect the land, particularly for communities, ensuring that they have enough for their own farming needs, etc., if you do not introduce investment in agriculture, commercial agriculture, you will never get that transformation. So you must look at this land thing within a total context and base it upon the specificity of the country concerned.
It's time to go, but not until President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf leaves this recommendation.
If we may leave with you one strong point made by the report. Every nation, directly or indirectly, is at risk. Evidence was happening. Syria, Egypt, Ukraine, And so it behooves us all to come up with the responses to ensure more equity, more participation, more education, and all of those things that enable every citizen to feel like they have a stake in the future, and that stake will ensure peace, stability, and equal development to all.
The event is over, and as President Sirleaf leaves the venue, she wanted to know what was happening back home, and she jokingly asked me,
Ebola. You're poor behaving yourself. Yeah, I know.